Welcome everyone to the third panel, which is, as you can see, is called Obfuscation, Decontextualization, the Limits of Critical Design. Its place in the conference is a little unsettled or unfixed because it's meant to look at the themes that we've been talking about, try to look at them from other disciplinary perspectives. And see that when what appears to us to be at the center of design, when imagined from other places or other concerns, reveals something which then could be very critical itself for design thinking. And I was actually very amused when I first saw the poster, and I think it's still up, that this sense of non-placement actually permitted the website the way that we were ascribed to different departments. I was in Damien's department, history, philosophy, sociology, which I'm fine. And there are at certain points there are commas, pluses to indicate history, philosophy, plus social science. But in Daniel's case, it's a lot of slashes, film, animation, video, and then Rhode Island School of Design is also a practice. Brhigu is still in sociology, yes, which he is not, so I should correct that. I just copied it from the site. He is in anthropology. So, but this confusion is, I think, productive and shows precisely the possibility of these kind of thinking to come from various disciplinary perspectives or be at the boundary or threshold. So let me very briefly introduce our panelist, Yuriko Saito, in history, philosophy, and social sciences at RISD, works with ethics of production and making, everyday ethics, and she would describe it more in detail. Sometimes it deals with issues of food, but also with how the rim of that glass in front of her is curved, and what kind of implications it has for where that plastic comes from and how it's sourced and how labor works on it. Daniel Peltz, equally diverse set of concerns under his practice in film, animation, and video. He's a practicing artist, a performance artist with work in all over the world, from Sweden recently to as well as in the United States, and has been a great interlocutor for me personally at RISD in defining or understanding what criticality means in different arenas. Brhigupati Singh, Brhigu, a very good friend from Brown, teaches at anthropology, not sociology. Would you like to be in sociology? No? Okay. But between sociology and philosophy, his first book is called Anthropology and the ground between anthropology and philosophy. And his second book, which just came out, Poverty and the Quest for Life, also combines the two perspectives, looking at an anthropological inquiry, but what sort of philosophical lenses are usually deployed in looking at the world, and how we can transform them to reveal new forms of existence, aspirations. And he looks at a poor community in central India, and he'll describe his work in that regard today. I myself teach in art history. I'm an architectural historian. My work deals with third world development and how design has influenced or defined the idea of third world development. I'm searching for my slide here. The conference, or the idea of this panel in discussion with Damien, came from a very simple question. How does design, and largely design, also arts, can define, acknowledge, reflect, deal with complexity on the ground? What I argue is that usually in the mainstream, when designers go abroad, especially abroad, dealing with a context which is different, in which they have to talk across difference of race, class, gender, all these historical tropes if you will. When they have to encounter it, they try to work with the most ethical, earnest point of view, but nevertheless flatten the complexity on the ground. So even the most well-meaning design erases historical complexity rather than acknowledging it. And therefore it fails. Fails in a literal sense that it erases the existence. If there are two groups of poor on the ground, and designers go in and make a school, and I'll show you a specific example, for the poor in the village, if they don't recognize that division, the poor, one poor will benefit from the school, the poor of the poor won't, right? But even their existence is now obfuscated from representation, from gaining access, or their existence being recognized. So is there a way that we can still make the same school and show that? My work, I'll skip over those slides, deals with how that discourse of experts going elsewhere and experts from, it's a two-sided thing, so people go and people come, talking about specific way of helping the poor and defining them, you know, the whole idea of third world development, funded by specific institutions, creates this sort of network of international experts, and they produce certain categories like the poor, the village, which are very much in currency, unexamined in our social engagements, both in poor, and you know, it's hard to use, not use that word, right? I mean, it's a flattening word. And disprivileged, if you want to call it, communities across the world. And architecture, I argue, is an amazing instrument which frames a certain idea of labor and the poor. But I'll focus or open the panel with more contemporary example. So what happens at MoMA, everyone is familiar with, Museum of Modern Art in New York. Every 60 years or so, MoMA has this, you know, they wake up at night that we haven't been doing any social engagement, and they mount say, no, we are a socially responsible institution. It's not just about high-end architecture, and they do something, which I mean, they've been waking up more recently. So, you know, there's this was 2010. This exhibition, small scale, big change, describing socially sensitive architectures of social engagement all over the world. And now there has been another one more recently. So I want to give an example of this school, Methi Handmade School in Radrapur, Bangladesh, designed by an Austrian architect. I've talked to the architect, I've talked to the curators, and they're both all very well-meaning. And it was, you know, described as made from local materials. The community participated, and you know, they were all building this school together. And in the end, what produced was this fabulous school, you know, with children, happy child, right in front of you. And what else do you need? So there was proof of that village, you know, finally got their school, right? But there was this line in the conference catalog, and if you look up, you know, the other discussions of the project, that a lot of material was stolen. So you have to convince people, don't steal the bamboo and, you know, mud blocks from your school. This is your school, right? What's wrong with you? Your children are going to go there. And they kept stealing it. So like, well, it's a long-term problem, cultural problem. We'll have to, you know, send another mission to educate them. It turns out, if you do a different Google search, you don't have to be an anthropologist, but you know, simply from a different Google search, you get a different idea or a picture of historical complexity. There are two kinds of poors. In fact, I would say more. But one are poor who own property, right? And then there are tribals. And within those tribals, there are various groups of classified tribals, or some are called primitive tribals, denotified tribals, right? And those are the poorest of the poor. They don't own any property. Their land actually had been taken hundreds of years ago, first by the Mughal transformation of the landscape, then the British, and then the national governments, right? So the property landed in the hands of the poor with property. Now the school is being made, and the people who are stealing material are the poor, the tribals, the poor of the poor who don't own material property in this village and who work for these poor. They have no stake in this school. They are so poor that they can't even send their children. They won't be able to send their children in this school. So the only recourse or only engagement with this is to steal material, right? That's the mode of survival for them. So I asked the museum curator when he visited Rizdi, well, is there a way that we can show this division, right? And I suggested or made a suggestion. One way to do that would be make the same school there. Right? How many of us are going to go that school, see that school? Not me, most probably, right? Make the same school there, but in the MoMA exhibition, ask your architect to make a speculative drawing of this school 10 years from now, where maybe the upper story has been stolen. Right? Or ask them to design the school with material that is meant to be stolen. Right? Then you bring into existence of a group that you were obfuscating even from recognizing that they exist. Right? So design can do that. There's a brilliant story in Brigu's book about these tribals in central India who go to the forest, and I mean they don't own the forest, but at weddings they say, "I give you this hill," right, to the other tribe. The tribe, "I give you this hill." What are they giving? They don't own the hill. It's the picking rights, right? The right to pick wood from that forest, which is not owned by them. It's a different relationship with the land, of a different idea of ownership, right? So now I imagine maybe, okay, instead of generic idea of material to be stolen, maybe color-coded. There are some red bamboos, there are some green bamboos, there are some blue bamboos. We recognize that within tribal communities there are all these other divisions, and they at their weddings come to this school and say, "I give you classroom 4A," as a right to steal material from that. Right? These are not so mind-boggling concepts. That is the historical reality, and design for them, for us designers, we don't have the lens or the categories that we employ doesn't allow us to read or deploy this complexity in a productive, quote-unquote, critical way to bring it into as part of the problem. How much time do I have? Okay. Very quickly, another example in this was a school at Gando done by in Burkina Faso by this architect Diablos Kare. The idea was you teach these workers welding, and the rest of the school will be built by brick. And it was thought to be, you're teaching them employment, and all these workers would go and find projects, and it would be such a wonderful thing. Again, if you look at the history, especially of Burkina Faso and tribal Burkina Faso, it is divided by tribes and tribal cultures, and not tribes like, old tradition, whatever. These tribes were designed by the British as a way of indirect rule. So they didn't see any white person, policing them with a gun. They were done by new formation of new network of local chiefs who were given immense penal power, judicial power to deploy people from mines to the city to the farmyard, depending on the demands of the colonial economy. And it created, you couldn't go from one village to the other without having the paper signed by the chief. So it's an immensely saturated landscape with very clear divisions, right, and antagonisms. So after independence, those antagonisms continue. This guy might learn all the welding that he can, but he will not be able to move from this village to that. This is infinite distance, right? So I suggested this to the curator, teach them different welding techniques, not one. So as they move and weld houses all over, there's a cartography of difference, which recognizes the restriction of history and the restriction that history places on movement. Contemporary example, this is a new project at MoMA about imagining future cities. This is Lagos. Architects now love Lagos. And it's like, this is such a wonderful place, and everyone is like, things are happening. So what would it look like in the future? I think it's not too far, 2050. Fourth mainland bridge has finally established a ring road around Lagos, and it is now 20 minutes across the city center by speedboat. The new city center combines the innovative cultures of Makoko, the grand ambitions of Eco-Atlantic City, and the characteristics of Venice and Amsterdam. Why? So we imagine that the world will modernize according to the same criteria, the secular criteria of poor to working class to entrepreneurs to self-sufficient, whatever. Right? That's our idea of globalization. It won't. All you need to do is do a different Google search, and you know that these images, red, green, and blue, are not just because they want to paint their houses different color, they're highly coded gang divisions. Lagos is the most entrenched gang boundary in the world. And it is not just gang boundary along drugs, but also divided along religious lines. So these are Christian, different sects of Christianity, Muslim divisions, and they are hired, and these divisions are negotiated by the students, and who are actually the power groups, or intermediary between power groups and the ground from that university. So if you're going to imagine a future of Lagos, don't imagine that those politics will disappear. This red brick will have a cross on it, and this green one will have a crescent on it, and the access should not be going to the downtown, but to the university. Of course, the MoMA curator said, can't do that, we will lose our sponsors. So can we do that? That's the question this panel will ask. Okay, I'll turn it over to
Oh, okay.
use the mic. I thought I was teaching a class. I could walk around.
Okay. Is that okay, Damien? Okay. So, well, Ijlal is a hard act to follow, and actually the whole morning sessions were really hard act to follow. And my talk, I feel, is going to be very sort of different. I teach philosophy, my expertise is aesthetics, and so my contribution is going to be more in terms of the sort of the way in which that we experience object aesthetically, and how that has a bearing on various problems. So I won't be addressing specifically about design, but I think that there are lots of design implications. My viewpoint and examples are strictly from US and partly from Japan. That's where I'm from, but I've been living in the States more than I lived in Japan. So it is very limited because I am very concerned about the aesthetics regarding consumerism. My work in aesthetics has been focused on everyday aesthetics, and in particular, I have been very concerned about the way in which aesthetics, which is sometimes considered to be kind of like a fluff or superficial, really has severe consequences, better or worse, on the quality of life and state of the world. And let me give you a few examples. Some of them are kind of silly, but nevertheless very serious. The quintessential aesthetic ideal of domesticity in the United States is green lawn, and now we are beginning to realize the environmental cost of cultivating, maintaining green lawn. But many people keep on doing that because they want to uphold that aesthetic ideal. The laundry detergent. See, I'm really interested in everyday, really mundane. So if you compare these two laundry detergents, the seventh generation, which is environmentally sound, that essentially failed the consumer report grading because they are lacking the kind of optical brightener, which is essentially a blue fluorescent dye, which makes a white shirt bright white. And so the end product of the laundering shirt is very dismal. When you try to dry laundry, the many communities in the United States, they prohibit laundry hanging, outdoor laundry hanging. Why? Well, because it's an eyesore, it's unsightly. So again, the aesthetic is concerning the effect to the environment. When you go to grocery store, many fruits and vegetables are uniform color, uniform size, shape, and it is because one-third of the fruits, farm fruits and vegetables have been discarded for the farmer or the supermarket for aesthetic reasons. And these are rejects. the cucumbers rejects from European economic community. Because they have a very specific standard about the curvature of the cucumber. Thank goodness for a French supermarket, which instituted the inglorious fruit. They have a specific bin of all the deformed vegetables and fruits and sell it very cheap. And supposedly they are doing really well. But anyway, these are kind of like a very mundane, silly examples, but to show how our aesthetic preference and taste have serious consequences, which we don't normally think about. Now comes to when we contemplate on the aesthetics involved in our consumerism in the United States. As Virginia Posterel mentions, aesthetics, whether people admit it or not, is why you buy something. Sometimes, yes, we do buy things out of necessity, but in this day and age, most people buy things because because it's more stylish and it's more updated. So we fall into this perceived obsolescence phenomena. Because I grew up in Japan, when I came to the States and then had family raising children, I always wondered why, starting August, there's a frenzy of back-to-school sale. And I never understood that, and because some of the clothes and the sneakers and backpacks from the previous year still work. But there's this frenzy of having to update the wardrobe. This one is the recent Time magazine. I apologize for the sort of the page from which it was taken. U.S. children make up just 3.1% of the global kids population, but American families buy 40% of the world's toys. So that's pretty staggering. So the people here are suffering from the recent book, Stuffocation. We are suffocating with stuff. But the problem really is much more serious than us suffering from stuffocation. This is the what is making these products available. That is usually happening away from here. I'm quoting from this work by my colleague, Aesthetics or Elsewhere, who says mines, particularly open pit mines or mountains, mountaintop removal mines are seen by many as ugly. So too with logging sites, as well as the various industrial facilities from which the raw materials for even the most beautiful buildings and artworks are sourced. Same point is made by David Orr. The problem is that we do not often see the true ugliness of the consumer economy, and so are not compelled to do much about it. The distance between shopping malls and the mines, wells, corporate farms, factories, toxic dumps, and landfills, sometimes half a world away, dampens our perceptions that something is fundamentally wrong. And it's interesting that, of course, they are concerned about human rights violation, environmental degradation, but they couch the whole thing in aesthetic terms, ugliness. So taking the notion of aesthetics of elsewhere, these are the pairs, here and elsewhere, another here and elsewhere, another here and elsewhere. The top right is, of course, the Bangladesh garment factory collapse, and here and elsewhere. So when we have this kind of disconnect or conflict between the positive aesthetic value here and the negative aesthetic value elsewhere, what do we do about it? Does it have any bearing on the aesthetic value of things here? The mainstream aestheticians in philosophy circle that I hang out with usually want to separate the two considerations. So this is a representative of that view. Jane Forsey, who wrote this Aesthetic of Design a couple of years ago, the fact that some objects were made in a third world factory under dismal conditions will certainly affect our moral judgment of the objects, depending on our view of international trade and labor laws, but not our aesthetic judgment of their beauty. So the tendency is to try to not have aesthetic value subsumed under moral value, or have the moral value dictate the aesthetic value. So that's the sort of motivation behind this kind of tendency to separate. I am not agreeing with that. I rather align myself with, again, the aesthetics of elsewhere guy, that is the improvement in aesthetic value in our surroundings worth the diminishment of aesthetic value where we aren't. We are not talking about zero-sum game, so it's not like if we want to increase the aesthetic value here, then by necessity we decrease the aesthetic value elsewhere. That's not, the situation. So can we have the kind of aesthetic value increase here while also increasing aesthetic value elsewhere? And probably the most prominent view of that is, from David Orr. In the largest sense, what we must do to ensure human tenure on the earth is to cultivate a new standard that defines beauty as that which causes no ugliness somewhere else or at some later time. It's a very strict notion of beauty, but it sort of really rang a bell. And as I was thinking about, when I read this book first, that really popped out in my mind because I was reading as an aesthetician. And then the more I thought about it, I recalled this famous saying of Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So we can almost substitute injustice with ugliness and justice with beauty to read ugliness anywhere is a threat to beauty everywhere. So I think it's sort of getting at the same kind of notion that we are all intertwined, and our tendency is to sort of separate and not to address what doesn't directly concern me because it's occurring somewhere else. No, that's artificial separation, so this Martin Luther King's, of course, he was talking about civil rights, but I think that has some kind of resonance to what I am thinking about. So if we want to have this kind of consciousness raising about beauty here and ugliness there, what do we do? And that's where I'm kind of stuck in terms of whether or not design can really address that. And the only thing I can think of, not as from the designer's point of view, but in general, is to have a kind of education which will cultivate what I would call consumer aesthetic literacy. We teach art education, art history, and so on in order to cultivate our sensibility to be able to appreciate works of art. So why can't we do the same thing with consumer goods? I know it's not going to go down well in schools, but there has to be some way in which that we have to get this aesthetics of elsewhere really in the public domain in a very popular way. Possibly in the form of like Inconvenient Truth or Food Inc., that kind of, if we can come up with an equivalent. I showed in my class Manufactured Landscape by Bertensky, and because I thought, well, that could be one of the closer examples. My students had a lot of problems with that, so I didn't put that in there. They had lots of critical comments about that. So that's one sort of a question I have. Aesthetics of elsewhere, is that a useful concept to use in thinking about the aesthetics involved in this problem? And the other one is what I'm thinking about is a paradigm shift of consumer aesthetics. We are in the frenzy of pursuing and appreciating something which is new, novel, fashionable, up-to-date, cutting-edge, and perfection, which does not tolerate any kind of damage or signs of aging, such as wear and tear. So that's a sort of mindset which fuels our frenzy of getting newer and newer and newer things. Or if something gets a little chip or cracks, then we want to throw it away, and we want to replace that with something which is, quote, perfect. if that's the source of the problem, can we cultivate a different kind of aesthetic sensibility which celebrates something enduring, something longevity, something seasoned, something which works with nature, meaning that embracing and making creative use out of signs of aging, wear and tear, breakage, and so on. And working with that which already exists, like repurposing, reusing, repairing, and build that up as a sort of aesthetic category or aesthetic value, which would inspire people to keep the objects and then handle that in various ways. And I'm bringing the sort of Japanese traditional stuff. Not that we have to be nostalgic and we have to resurrect the old kind of practice, but rather to show that something which is aging, which shows cracks, which may show the sign of wear and tear, is not necessarily aesthetically negative. This is the kind of thing which can be used to reformulate our concept of what counts as aesthetically positive. So as you know, the lacquerware, as the aging process happens and rubbing and so on, the top layer sort of rubs off, and then you get the black sort of inner layer. So you get the sort of interesting pattern. And many Japanese pottery, after a certain time, starts having a hairline fracture, the sort of crackles, and that can add to the aesthetic appeal of the object. This practice, this is a hobby in Japan, so I'm not saying that we should all get into this kind of hobby, but again, this repair with gold technique, that shows how, again, the sign of the defect or breakage and a sign of repair that can add to the aesthetic appeal of the object. Not, it does not necessarily take it away. The last example I have is the notion of mottainai, which was a source of inspiration for Wangari Maathai. When she visited Japan, she really sort of liked that concept. And essentially what it is that, well, you don't throw away things. So you try to make use of even the worn tattered fabric and try to make something, use it for very utilitarian purpose, repairing. But then you get this kind of very sort of interesting patterns. It's like a quilting, but this was not a decorative object. It is a utilitarian object. And so this is really a sign of repair, but nevertheless, it doesn't have to be aesthetically negative. And by taking this as an example, I'm sure there are many other examples of celebration of aging appearance and then taking advantage of the, quote, imperfection for aesthetic purpose. And this is just one example because I happen to know Japanese aesthetic tradition. But by showing this, I'm not saying that, well, therefore, let's create a new trend and do what you call distressed jeans, which sell for $200. So that defeats the whole purpose. But rather, this is simply to show how the sign of so-called defect or so-called imperfection can be made use of in creating something aesthetically positive. And when you think about it, we are in that sort of a frenzy of pursuing the new, the novel, the stylish, the updated, and so on. And in a way, it's a self-defeating, movement because you can never achieve it, and whatever new becomes old tomorrow. And also, as a concluding remark, this whole the presentation really is geared for making us think about, okay, what do we mean by object? So there's this object, and this is what we usually refer to as object, and what it looks like, and so on. And we usually conceive of this as a kind of discrete, independent entity. But that's where the whole thing sort of goes problematic. Can we, because if we are dissociating this, decontextualizing this as if that it didn't have any history and it will not have any history, but rather this is a, this object that we call object is spatially, temporally relational entity. It is in the middle of, its own history, and it will continue. And spatially, this object is not simply here, but it is related to elsewhere. So I think that it calls into question, what should be the notion of object and what should be the proper attitude that we should have with the object. It's not simply a thing, but rather it's much more than that. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank Ijlal and Damien and Ian for inviting me to be part of the conversation today. I'm going to show work from 3 site-responsive engagements, one here at RISD and also in Providence, one in the rural Swedish glass factory town of Reimyra, and one from Cambridge, Massachusetts, a period I spent with the Department of Parking, Traffic, and Transportation. All of which explore my interest in shifting the character of labor within institutional settings to experiment with alternate ways of being in the world within the roles that our bodies are asked to inhabit in those spaces. So the first one that I wanted to start with, this image is an artifact of. It came out of going on sabbatical during the peak of the global financial crisis and trying to process in some ways. During that sabbatical, I was spending time in Indonesia looking at particularly Balinese Hinduism and offering practices. And I was really interested in their relationship to the tourist economy there, and the elaborate ritual calendar as a kind of attempt to escape the elaborateness of existing in a neoliberal society. And I was also processing some things at home. I was talking to my parents a lot over Skype, and I noticed that my father was checking the performances of his retirement portfolio on a daily basis. And I was processing kind of what he was doing with that information. And also processing the messages that I've always received since I started working here at RISD from the financial planners who are charged with planning our retirement, our market-invested retirements, or facilitating our choices amongst the options that are available to us in planning our market-driven after-work lives. And I started to work with this connection between the notion of the afterlife and the notion of after-work life, and to create a series of ritual objects to connect to my retirement portfolio, which I was feeling fairly disconnected from. And these two actually are products of that engagement. So I produced a series of ceramic vessels and batiks. These are both based on traditional Indonesian batik designs, but they represent the performance of my TIA-CREF retirement portfolio over the 7 years leading up to my sabbatical. And further, they explore the relationship between, when engaged in conversations with TIA-CREF, the first thing, and most financial service providers, the first thing that you need to do is determine, to categorize yourself in the world according to your relationship to risk, which I thought was a very interesting way of thinking about who we are as people in the world. So the first thing you had to do was determine your risk profile. And based on that risk profile, that designates what types of assets you might be eligible for. I made a decision during this process that I would make no changes within the portfolio, that all of my work on the portfolio would go into this realm. So going from the outside in, we can see the performance of the very outer area is showing the performance of the Dow expressed as price and volume over the 7-year period of my employment. And you can see this interesting inverse relationship between those two. If you look down here, this is the performance of the Dow as price and volume. And here's the copper stamp that produces that repeat. Moving inwards, we have the asset allocation itself, according to Kawang, one of the most prominent symbols in Indonesian batik. It's also seen in other cultures. You can find it on the pyramids. Moving into parang, which is the crooked sword, one of the most common motifs. Also, there are many versions of them in Indonesian batik. This one is showing kind of this is asset allocation, so it's myself as a categorical self. But slightly more precise than this global measurement. And here, the most precise measurement, the individual performance of the assets that make up my portfolio over the 7-year period. Coming out of that engagement, I came back to Providence and started working with a company called KLR Wealth Management, who has offices here in Providence and in Waltham and in Newport. And I brought them my very modest wealth and asked them to develop a proposal for how to manage it, and came to the meeting where they presented me with that proposal with a counter-proposal. And my counter-proposal was to lead a series of workshops for their staff to train to respond percussively to micro-fluctuations in the gains and losses of their individual retirement assets. So to work with the financial service planners themselves to train ourselves to listen to each other and use the form of the djembe drum circle to perform and register these micro-fluctuations of gain and loss in the performance of our after-work life portfolios. I have a video here. I'll see if I can get it to play. Well, I don't think I might need to skip some of it because it's. I'd like to actually go forward, but it doesn't seem to let me here. It's okay. We'll leave that one there. It's kind of best actually to leave that portion unrepresented, I think. But I worked with an ethnomusicologist, Asha Tamarisa from Brown, to develop that workshop and performed it with all of the financial service providers at KLR in the space of a space they call Lunch and Learns, which is a space that's dedicated to learning changes in the tax code. It's important to me within these works to insert these gestures into these kinds of ready-made institutional spaces. I wanted to spend some time now talking about a project in rural Sweden, in Reimyra. This has been a long-term place-based research project that came out of a 2007 Fulbright term there, and I've returned every year since. It's become important to me within this work to continue to return to a place, and one that really hasn't continued to invite me, but that I make a commitment to bring myself to. Alongside the work that I've been making there, my partner and I, who's also on the faculty here in the Jewelry and Metals Department, Cici Westerberg, and I formed an artist-run organization there that's been really dedicated to bringing, it has several functions, but one of the important ones is to create a space for us to counteract in some way our work within more institutionalized educational spaces like RISD, to really experiment with and model kind of counter proposals to the way that learning is structured here, particularly in terms of the economic models that it's structured on. I'm working on a long-term project here, though, that involves the development of a conceptual product catalog, and is interested in this notion of performing labor. It came out of being in this setting and being really struck by the way that the factory itself had been restaged to performatively bring the most photogenic performers of the labor of glass making forward. The glass factory itself is quite interesting, as is the case with many of these types of hybrid industrial tourist sites, wherein the workers are engaged simultaneously in this embodied craft practice and in the performance of that labor and the production of a tourist spectacle. And I've become really interested in how to insert my own labor as an artist inside these systems of manufacturing objects and manufacturing tourist spectacle in an already problematized and implicated way, in order to ask questions of myself and others about the contemporary status of the laboring body, and to put myself in the best position to receive the knowledge contained in those postures. So this is an image of one of the tour groups that's coming through, photographing the labor of the workers. And here you can get a little bit of a sense of the scene at the factory. I was really struck by a couple of things. One that you'll see in the upper left corner of this image is a picture window, which was part of a renovation to the store, where they installed a picture window which had exactly the same aspect ratio as video at the time, to look out from the store onto the factory. And the other was that when you came in and when they brought these tour groups through, the workers had been trained or trained themselves to not respond to anybody that was there. So the tour guide would come through and speak on the microphone about the action that was happening, and the workers would continue to perform their work. And there was something about this position being kind of trapped between in this state of dual consciousness that I found myself really drawn to. I started working with various ways of inserting my labor into this situation. The very first one was a really simple action where I just worked with the workers to train ourselves to make glass without without physically looking at the glass. So using just the image of the live feed camera that I'm holding to make the glass, offsetting our vision just slightly to an image which was projected onto the heat shield. And it's just important to kind of keep in mind as we look at these images that they are both images of a process and images of a further production of a tourist spectacle as these projects themselves become consumed by these tour groups that are moving through. So in a way, part of the struggle was with kind of how to insert and instrumentalize my labor, make it necessary in some way for them, and also insert myself into the position of producing the tourist spectacle that they were producing. It was interesting coming out of that project. I had a conversation with one of the workers where he said, well, actually, Daniel, it was interesting to do the work because I don't actually look at glass much when I'm making it. Most of the time I just glance down to confirm what I already know I'm doing. And it struck me that in trying to reflect on this situation, I had fallen into the trap of overemphasizing the visuality of the spectacle itself. I wanted to come back to this image, which I showed earlier. It's actually an extraction from a newspaper article that documents another project that I engaged in there. That project began in collaboration with my partner, C.C. Vesterberg, where I designed and worked with the workers to produce a receptacle to collect their sweat. This object was produced and then used on the factory floor. That sweat was then processed into a perfume, and the bottle for which was produced through a relational gesture that was also produced on the factory floor. And that perfume was then installed and inserted back into the commercial product line that was available within the factory's store. It was priced prohibitively, so it didn't sell at all. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to not say anything more about that project. These images are from a recent project where I developed a hieroglyphic language to communicate with the glass workers, to in some sense more purely commodify and aestheticize their labor. The typical communication between designer and glassblower is through drawing. I was really interested in abstracting the actions of glassblowing into a language that I could use to write objects to them. They then interpreted the actions from those hieroglyphic writings, each in different ways. This is the production of one of them. And again, all of this action is happening as part of both the industrial production line, next to the industrial production line in an undifferentiated way, thus also participating in the production of the tourist spectacle. Those objects were then inserted into the Glass Museum, and also here's a few of them. The score for this one, these are all the same score. The score reads, gather, roll, blow, pinch, pinch, pull, twist, counter twist, pull, warm in. Pull, constrict, caress, drop, score, cut off. I then reproduced those at human scale as a series of labor portraits, which are featured here. I wanted to talk about one other project in my time there, which is a public commission that I did along with C.C. Vesterberg, and this one is in the forest, which we were having a conversation about over lunch. There's actually no separation, I think, between the factory and the forest. They should probably be seen as one thing. The piece is essentially a place. It's a place off the side of the road. We called the place Evian Forest in Rémy-les-Graces. And it's a roundabout in the middle of the forest, and a structure. Inside that structure are a series of brewing bottles based on the design for the original object produced at the factory, which was a brewing bottle. And brewing inside these bottles are saplings that were given by the lumber company that owns the forest. And they're slowly dying in a few liters of Evian water. And you can see that, you know, as you approach the object, it breaks down in terms of its kind of commercial production, and you can see the kind of handmade nature of the tops of them. I was really interested in that site too. It also has a nighttime state. I was really interested in this site as well just in terms of processing my own relationship to Sweden, which I had really gone to on my Fulbright naively as this kind of like escape from the U.S. and this sense that somehow maybe there was something left of the beauty of the Scandinavian social state. And somehow that seems to be embodied by the place as well. I remember coming to this site where I was invited, my partner invited me as part of a group of international artists who were invited to make works in the factory. And it was my first time getting a break from teaching in a long time, and I would go in the forest and feel so that I was communing with nature, you know. And the mosses were so incredibly beautiful, and even the snails were quite beautiful to me. And it took me many years to realize that this was a garden, you know, and it wasn't just anyone's garden, like that this was a planted forest. And there's an interesting, very simple optical phenomenon that happens when you approach these forests, whereby they at first appear, or from certain angles appear to be kind of randomly planted. And then as you move around them, you start to really see the rows. And there are points at which those rows really align and points at which they break down. And I was really interested in this roundabout structure as a way of kind of visualizing that breakdown. And the objects themselves do something very similar as you move around them. Maybe in this video too. Yeah, so if you watch the foreground and the background, you might get a little sense of this phenomenon that I'm talking about, where these moments of alignment and unalignment filter in and out. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? I'll show one last project and then I'll stop. So I'm going to close with this piece from the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, nearby. This was part of a project I was invited to make a public work for the city of Cambridge, and I said that for the work I wanted to create a series of parking regulations, and I created a position for an artist in residence at the Department of Parking, Traffic and Transportation. And I inhabited that position for a year, doing field work with a number of the different members of the organization, and then producing a series of temporary parking regulations that were passed through the city council and officially enacted for the period of the exhibition. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll just talk about one that I thought was relevant to today's conversation. This is the U.S. patent filed in 1958 for an object that Americans know quite well. It's sometimes referred to as the Denver boot. It's an interesting object that was actually produced by a man named Frank Marag, who was a violinist for the symphony in Denver and also a friend of a local police officer. And we worked with the design for the Denver boot. I did this project also in collaboration with Cici Vesterberg, and designed a new kind of soft boot and a regulation for the dissemination of that boot, which was a highly idiosyncratic regulation. It was similar to the hieroglyphic glass scores. It was basically, the whole point of the regulation was that it required interpretive work by the booting crew in deciding, for example, whether a car was within 1.5 inches of its intended destination. And the objects themselves were produced as part of the regulation, were produced in the building where the workers came and where people came to pay their tickets, and they were produced with the regulation on display so that people could encounter the new regulation which had gone into effect, and the objects being produced here by Cici Vesterberg. This is George, who was the head of the booting crew, applying one of them. They circulated as kind of ambiguous gift annoyances in terms of people's reception of them. And optically, the hope was that they would kind of produce a similar kind of shift as that optical shift in the trees, whereby from a distance they would register as a boot and then kind of transform in your mind as you approach them. But I was really mostly interested in shifting the character of the labor of the booting teams. And I'm really interested in this gesture in particular, which is when booting crews apply boots, they're trained to do it in pairs. And one person's job is to liaise with the public. And then the other person's job that George is performing right now is to apply the boot as fast as humanly possible and not to say a word to anybody who comes. And I was really interested in that kind of locked-in, mechanized posture, and wanted to intervene in some way in the character of that labor, and that was the intention of this image. And I think that's the end of my time. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and I also want to begin by thanking Ijlal and Damien and Ian for inviting me, even though I'm a complete outsider to the design world. But I don't speak as a complete stranger to the themes of the conference, hopefully. From within my own discipline of anthropology and philosophy or critical theory, I've been thinking for the last few years about what it means to be critical in a way that doesn't lead only to negations, and how futures might be conceived, not necessarily in the mode of utopia, but more often as an anthropologist encounters the future through particular encounters with everyday life in specific life worlds. So to respond to the task that this conference sets us, in this presentation I want to offer two thoughts that have had a long life within anthropology, which I hope might be useful for thinking about critical design. The first thought relates to the place that death and the afterlife have in our thinking, in a different meaning of critical as a state of illness and being towards death. And in the second thought, I want to ask how we might think about possessions in a way that's neither private nor common property. For both these thoughts, I'll be drawing on my recently published book, which Ijlal mentioned, Poverty and the Quest for Life, which came out just last month. Before turning to my own material, though, let me pause just for a moment and ask, are there any models for how anthropologists might speak to theorists of design? The precedent I want to begin with is a recent article in the journal Design Issues that Damien had very helpfully pointed us to by the anthropologists Tim Ingold and Mike Anusas. In their essay titled Designing Environmental Relations from Opacity to Textility, that resonated for me very deeply with our panel's theme of obfuscation, Anusas and Ingold argue that mainstream design practice is oriented towards producing objects that alienate human perception from the flows in which humans and non-humans are embedded. The alienation, they're arguing, occurs through an emphasis on surfaces that obscure what Anusas and Ingold call infrastices, a concept they offer in place of the more common word infrastructure, with its connotations of fixity and support. Affirming design experiments like the power-aware cord, which draws attention to the variable flows of energy on which a product depends, Anusas and Ingold are calling for design to make visible the invisible processes of flow, rather than leaving the energetic composition of our everyday lives largely imperceptible. So I want to add two further thoughts to what Anusas and Ingold are offering us, while also signaling that the argument they're making can be seen as part of a much wider conversation, what some would describe as a turn or return to vitalism or new materialism, as people have called it in contemporary philosophy, composed of a variety of figures like Jane Bennett, Brian Massumi, Viveros de Castro, Eduardo Kohn, and others. So as the new materialists would agree or have argued from different vantage points, rather than a secure distinction between animate and inanimate matter, we could say that humans and non-humans are composed of energy, we can call it force or life force, which is a key or central concept of my book, to which I add the supplementary concept of fluctuation, or I call it waning life, and I'll come to that in a moment. And second, if you're joined by energetic lines, as Anusas and Ingold call it, then I'm going to argue that the lines are also composed of what anthropologists have called exchange relations. So this might sound a bit abstract, so let me try to bring these two thoughts closer to life through the particular world that I inhabited as an anthropologist. So the book that I'm referring to is based on a year and a half of fieldwork in Shahabad, a sub-district of 236 villages in Rajasthan at its border with Madhya Pradesh in central India. My primary focus in this book is on the Seheriyas, a community of former bonded laborers who now subsist mostly through small-scale agriculture and agricultural wage labor. Rather than focusing only on abjection, in the book I seek to understand how aspiration and vitality is imagined in such a milieu. The question of how one actually studies aspiration sent me back to many of the long-standing questions of critical social science, such as how do the poor encounter the state at an everyday level, or how does a subordinate group such as the Seheriyas negotiate and contest relations with neighboring higher castes and tribes. But rather than telling you the answers to these particular questions, since I speak as a foreigner both by discipline and by region, let me try to take you even further afield to the world of ancestral spirits and deities. I went in initially with entirely secular questions, but at some point in my research I realized that I didn't want to or I couldn't ignore the gods and spirits that also populate this landscape. At times this was for culturally specific reasons, as for caste, which I found couldn't be investigated only as a secular question. But once I started thinking about spirits, other questions emerged that were not specific only to caste or to India. Here's an example of one such question from an early chapter in my book in which I'm following a deity known as Thakur Baba, said to be the deified ghost of warriors who died in battle, who appear to high and low castes as a vision of a headless horseman in the central Indian landscape. Shrines like these overlap between popular Hinduism and Islam and are known either as Veer, warrior, or Peer, ascetic shrines. An active shrine would be approached with requests for healing or other everyday troubles that are often attributed to displeased ancestral spirits. While this phenomena like these might sound very local to some people, such a deity can also pose reasonably global questions, including a question which I realized that almost every canonical figure of social science, from Herbert Spencer to Durkheim to Victor Turner to Clifford Geertz, had tried to answer, namely, how can we think of the dead and spirits as participants among the living? So as a possible answer in my own book, following the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, I suggest the idea of varying thresholds of life as a way to conceive of a potentiality composed of the living, the undead, and the yet to be born. As anthropologists in many different parts of the world have found, death may not be the end of life, rather it might be understood as a movement to a different threshold, which has its own intensities and life force and forms of movement. Now some of you might be wondering, why am I telling you all of this? Shouldn't I be telling you about some very cool design experiment in Bangalore? Or if we are in a third world village and I want to be critical, then I should be telling you about some major failure of the World Bank or some equivalent demonic institution so that we can feel good in comparison. Let's say that I like deities, but I don't believe in demons. But more seriously, I'm telling you this because I think that the humble shrine of Thakur Baba has a small design lesson, or at least a thought to offer, not quite similar to what Yuriko was asking us to think about. At some point, I began to wonder who designs these shrines. Most people in the region pointed me to one particular family in Shahabad from the Ojha sculptor caste, whose caste-based occupation was to design these particular kind of memorial stones, as they're called in art history. In preparation to meet them, I read many different essays on the aesthetics of memorial shrines and prepared very elaborate questions. The sculptors, unfortunately, two brothers, were not very talkative. Our father taught us the basic design of different deities. His grandfather taught him. Who knows where he learned it from? The sculptors claimed no style or sect or spiritual mystery of any sort. They explained how they obtained raw material from a nearby quarry and how price differences between idols were calculated according to size and design. Having received much more dramatic narratives from spirit mediums about their possession experiences, I was initially disappointed that the sculptors didn't have more to say. But I slowly realized that the essential element of this act of spiritual creation wasn't a theological discourse that accompanied it, but what we could call a design innovation of sorts, namely that these shrines are built with an awareness of their own potential abandonment. They sometimes gain in beauty as they're abandoned, but they also persist with the possibility of a return of potency as a spirit medium or a troubled family may reclaim a shrine. I call this in my book waxing and waning life, which is a very different idea of non-human agency, not as a static vitality or a constant plenitude, but as a fluctuation. Which leads me to speculate, since we were invited to speculate, is it possible to think of design as a process oriented as much to the abandonment and afterlife of a thing as to the moment of its creation and use? This may be a shot in the dark, but let me go further and offer you two material instances also from my book where a design problem may be conceptualized in relation to what I'm calling varying thresholds of life. The instances relate to the two most urgent material questions in a place like Shahabad at present, the depletion of the water table and the sharp decline of forest cover. I first began to think about water because it recurrently appeared as the cause of the most common intercaste conflicts in Shahabad, with water scarcity having become an increasingly urgent issue in what used to be a relatively lush forest area till very recently. I found that this emergent water shortage is directly linked to a dietary shift, seen in many other parts of the world as well, from what are called coarser grains, such as millets, food grains, to finer grains, such as wheat, as a form of aspiration. Until a generation ago, a lower status group like the Saharias and many other poor across the world ate wheat maybe, in the case of the Saharias, once a year. Eating wheat, now much more widely available because of what are called green revolution technologies, is considered a sign of upward mobility, since coarser grains are seen as poor man's food. This shift would have been a very minor chapter in the global evolution of diets were it not for the fact that wheat consumes about 4 times as much water as millets. In a context like India, 80% of water usage is still agricultural, and according to very conservative estimates that I followed, as a result of groundwater overpumping, about 50% of the world's population is set to face some kind of water shortage by 2030, a shift that is caused in part by these seemingly ordinary dietary changes. In my book, I use this insight to reconsider the term quality of life, which, as I argue, can't be measured only by static minimum indicators such as calorific intake, as Amartya Sen famously defined a way of measuring absolute poverty, but rather as the ongoing relation between varying thresholds of life. What's good at one threshold, such as food, may create life-threatening possibilities at another threshold, such as water. So in this sense, in the book, I suggest that what it means to be critical in anthropology, and maybe Anusas and Ingold are making a very similar call for design through their idea of infrastices, is what I'm calling a mode of heightened attentiveness to the relationship between varying thresholds of life. So to return to the question of afterlife, consider my second example, the death of a forest. The Saharias, the community on which my book mainly focuses, are officially classified in the Government of India census as forest dwellers, Vanvasi. But the term makes less sense today because most Saharias survive through agricultural labor and there's not much forest left to speak of. Importantly, though, the quantity of land demarcated as forests in this area has remained stable over the last century and a half, totaling roughly 49% of land in Shahabad, compared with 22% agricultural land, with human settlements, villages, comprising only about 1% of Shahabad. So the perceived decline of forests is not a comment on the quantity of land, but on the quality of life in the forest. And here the form of death becomes more locally specific. In botanical terms, the forests of Shahabad would be classified as dry deciduous forests. So even in its heyday, it wouldn't have borne a kind of lush Amazonian feel. In my book, in a chapter called Who Ate Up the Forests, I take up different interpretations of what it means for a forest to die. Remote sensing satellite studies provide one measure through images and the changing pictures over time of tree or what is called crown cover density. But this is only one among other ways of measuring ruin. Among Saharias, the evidence for forest decline was not so much to do with crown cover, but rather the disappearance of many older, richer species of trees, and secondly, the now almost deafening absence of animals. A 1962 Forest Department report on Shahabad tells us, quote, big and small game animals are found in abundance in Shahabad, tigers, panthers, bears, deer, end quote. Nowadays, one could travel for hours through forest land without seeing even a squirrel. I would hear a common lament in Shahabad, in Hindi or in the dialect of the place, Sapai Dang Kha Gaye Hamari, which translates as they ate up our forest, from which the title of my chapter came. Although there are many competing narratives of cultability on who the they were who ate up the forest, some blamed the commercial felling practices of the State Forest Department, others blamed the encroachments of middle caste cultivators in the area, others still blamed the sudden influx of pastoralists into Shahabad, sheep herders and camel herders from other parts of India, themselves escaping new conditions of scarcity in many of the other parts of the country. So in many activist and scholarly accounts and policy accounts, it's a kind of redemptive alternative to such tragic resource conflicts, particularly over forests, is the institutional form known as joint forest management, also called community forestry in other parts of the world, where village-level committees, often in partnership with NGOs, are given user rights over demarcated forest enclosures for a specific period of time. 27% of India's forests are currently under JFM arrangements, and similar figures in many other parts of the world. After many decades of these kinds of endeavors being tried out, the initial excitement around community forestry as a completely redemptive idea has now very much faded. Various analysts, and kind of very much like what Ijlal was saying, have pointed out the flaws that recurrently emerge within these jointly managed institutional mechanisms. The tendency towards quick-growing, profit-oriented species, the short time horizon of projects, often a much shorter time span than most richer species of flora actually take to mature, and various forms of contestation that emerge in such endeavors, exactly what Ijlal was saying, if a naive idea of community in community forestry ignores or sometimes intensifies local conflicts. Many of these drawbacks were visible very much in the kind of joint forest projects underway in Shahabad during my fieldwork, under a program that was called the Van Jan Shakti Karyakram, Forest People Empowerment Program. And government programs often have these kind of very emancipatory titles. 90 forest enclosures were set up in Shahabad and with UNDP funding and local NGO partnerships. Fast-growing Jatropha trees, which is a species of tree very much in favor in many parts of the world because it's thought to be that someday it'll replace petrol in producing biodiesel. So Jatropha trees were the dominant plantation in most JFM enclosures, with saplings supplied by the Forest Department. As this round of projects began, older JFM forest enclosures lay scattered with broken boundary walls, memorials to earlier such efforts in Shahabad. And this is one such abandoned forest enclosure. The new and old boundaries around these were often a source of local conflict. I would hear forest officials voice a recurring disappointment with these programs after the program had been in place for 3 or 4 years. The Saharias don't feel any apnapan, an Hindi word for intimacy or ownership. For the forest enclosures, they think of it just as another source of mazduri, labor. If they get better pay somewhere else, they'll go there. So as it happened, the community forestry program was being dovetailed, as it's called in bureaucratic terminology, with a government employment guarantee welfare scheme where Saharias, tribals were paid a few rupees above the minimum wage to work in these forest enclosures. A welfare initiative like this could be read critically, as some scholars have read it, as a way for the government to extract cheap labor from tribal communities. Alternatively, it could also be seen as a blessing, as it was for many of the Saharia families I knew, as one possibility of a secure wage amidst very precarious economic circumstances, at least for the 7-year period that this community forestry program would run. The government officer's lament was not wrong though, and most Saharias I knew agreed. The community forestry program had not in any way encouraged a sense of apnapan, which as I said translates as a sense of intimacy or of a thing being one's own, between forests and so-called forest dwellers. Such a feeling may sound very much beyond the pale or logic of state policies, but this was among the aims even of the very prosaic national forest policy of India, which encouraged JFM efforts, and I'm quoting from India's forest policy, quote, envisaging it as essential to forest management that forest communities should be motivated to identify themselves with the development and protection of forests from which they derive benefits, end quote. So what might a sense of identification or ownership have looked like? Leaving aside legal definitions for a moment, liberal thought, following Locke most famously, calls it ownership or property when labor is joined to nature. But the Saharias were, after all, laboring in these forest enclosures, but without a sense of apnapan, a feeling of the thing being one's own. We might call this a sense of alienation from the object of one's labors. What would a feeling of non-alienation look like? Intimacy with things did not, as far as I could make out, and I say this after thinking very carefully about spirits and deities, intimacy with things didn't hinge on any Gaia-like feeling of oneness with nature. By now, I'd walked around enough in forests to know that the word tree was as generic a word as human. No one in the area would say tree without specifying a further detail about its jati, a word translatable as species or caste, occupation. Can trees have a caste? Some trees are more spiritual, like the peepal tree, often said to be a home for spirits, a quality recognized even by its scientific Latin name, Ficus religiosa. Others were more pragmatic, the tendu tree, in whose leaf the common bidi or small cigarette is rolled, the well-built and constantly threatened teak, sagwan, the dhokra, which there's an image of, that provides building material for dwellings. So if these names and trajectories were defined mainly by their use value, how different are they from a commodity? And would intimacy be no more than a fetish? We come to a delicate distinction here, or question regarding intimacies with things, and a thought with which I'll conclude. In studying intra and intercaste transactions, I sensed forms of possession and exchange that were not definable as property. And hopefully that speaks to your presentation. For instance, among Saharias, it's said that in earlier times, during marriages, in Deni, a ritual of giving, and this, Ijlal already gave away my punchline, but nevertheless, in earlier times during marriage, in a ritual of giving, a family would gift their daughter a sickle. Use this to earn your keep, they'd say, as part of the wedding ritual. We give you Jagmani Hill, naming a particular hill among the many hills in Shahabad. After giving away the hill, that particular family would not go to Jagmani Hill to gather forest produce. I take this to be a form of intimate possession. It's ours if we can abandon it or give it away. But the family didn't own the hill. Who owned the hill? According to critics, the colonial Indian Forest Act of 1865 that inaugurated state monopoly over forests effectively broke the link between humans and forests, to quote, I'm quoting a leading environmental historian. Still, these Deni transactions were possible until as recently as 2 decades back, which is when most people in the area date the sharp decline of forest cover. What was exchanged was a connection to the surroundings that included the potential to consume it. This Deni now rings hollow. There's no longer enough to give. Now there's nothing in the forest, as many Saharias in the area say. This lament, as I understand it, expresses something like the passing away of an intimate. Can this intimate be revived? I take this to be a different answer to Ijlal's question. Can you build a school that's meant to be stolen? My answer is yes, as long as we replace the word stolen with the anthropological problem, which might also be a design problem, of the kinds of exchange relations a thing might create in its afterlife. So that, in sum, is the clutch of ideas I hope to offer from my own neck of the anthropological woods, varying thresholds of life, exchange relations, and a form of ownership and intimacy that's neither private nor common property. I'll stop, but I'll leave you with an image which I hope might also be food for thought, created by the contemporary artist Subodh Gupta as the cover for my book, that evokes a world and a thing which for me belongs to the Saharias, but it might also belong to the toolkit of critical design. Thank you.
I was going to summarize the theme, but Brhigu did an excellent job. So we have ideas of different ideas of labor, times of labor, right? Different lives of objects and different ideas of ownership, right? They might seem philosophical, they might seem historical, they might seem anthropological, but these issues of limits of objects, the times of their existence, the time of labor, these are themes which are central to design and to whatever when we claim any shifting these definitions. Can we think through these definitions, new modes of operation and new ideas of our relationship to objects? So with that, I open up to you for questions. If you have any, we have limited time, but we can take up. Are there mics there?
Thank you so much. It's very great to hear this, other perspectives also. One debate that I often have with friends and people in the BFA, MFA, PhD group is, so is the status of the independent designer or the artist so coincident with capitalism and a sense of individual expression and entrepreneurship that we can't possibly imagine the kind of cultural production that would happen without that distribution economy. So when I hear the two of you speak, I am thinking a lot about, you said, for example, sculptors. I can hear you. That was very strange. That was a spirit. So I know this is a broad question, but I keep thinking, especially since we're at a school, for example, that has a glassblowing department that has both what you could say, you said workers, I would say designers or artists, and I keep wondering about any comments you could make about what you see as the future of cultural production that is not necessarily about individual expression, whether it's a hobby or a sculptor who knows his grandfather taught his father and that's it, or what it means to say these are the workers when you engage with glassblowers. Do we just inherit our culture and express it as a member of that culture, or should we continue to think about individual expression in critical design? That's the question.
I'll address the more, I think you shifted your question a little bit in the process of saying it out. The initial part had been very daring, and then you shifted it towards the end to individual and this thing. But the initial part that was very daring that I liked, is it possible to live outside capitalism, or are you necessarily implicated in it? I'll give a very short answer, and then maybe the others can address other parts of your question. One part of my question will make you happy, and the other part may not make you so happy. Judging by your own presentation. The part that will make you happy will be, I'll say, absolutely, and it depends on exchange relations and circuits, exactly like what you were describing, which are not necessarily only about capital. There are different forms of capital, and we can create circuits of exchange which are not independent of capitalism, but exist in a different logic of gift giving and exchange and all the things you had in your diagram, which were great. The part that will make you less happy is that anthropologists have thought about exchange a lot. And the sort of starting text for this for us is Marcel Mauss's The Gift. Famously, David Graeber and others have written about it. I disagree with David Graeber's interpretation because they take it to be an anarchist text. For me, the most deadly, interesting part of Mauss's thought about the gift and exchange relations and independent communities of exchange is that the gift is a theory of agonistic exchange. And that's what Ijlal's point was, that you can go anywhere. But the idea of utopia is dangerous to some extent, even for us, to save ourselves, because we eliminate the agonistic element from our thoughts. So we'll either be disappointed when agonistics begin, agonistics being cultures of contestation. That exchange is also, it's not competitive in the sense of capitalism, but it is agonistic in different senses.
I guess I think of these notions of artist and designer as cultural categories that we should make craft of. That we should hold fluidly and deploy strategically. So we had an interesting conversation at lunch about the exchange between you and the woman who's heading the master's program, where we were saying, well, what if the two of you kind of switched positions? Like, as opposed to being like, if you could kind of hold the ways in which the kind of radical anti-capitalist position that you're taking is also convenient to capitalism and convenient to your moment, right? How might you exchange that with someone else? Exchange that position. And I guess that's, I didn't come to this to this work attached to the idea of being an artist or a designer. I came to making work trained as an anthropologist, and really found these categories helpful in allowing me to live more fully and be the ways I wanted to be in the world.
Okay, I don't know whether I can answer the question directly, but I will share some thoughts. It seems to me that within capitalist production mode, there is a choice of getting in the bandwagon of a more newer, the kind of, the cult of the new. So that is part of the problem. But within capitalism, you probably can create some other mode of production which is not premised upon celebrating the cult of the new. And so to create a kind of, or design object or environment which is not like a frozen in time, but rather it sort of evolves with the human use and aging process. And to design a kind of object which would really live with that. So I think that there is a sort of choice even within capitalist system. This is a sort of personal anecdote, but I received this email from a student I had 14 years ago, all of a sudden out of blue. We have not been in touch at all. And he was an industrial designer, and he all of a sudden emailed me several weeks ago. And he said, well, I'm still thinking about your class. I teach ecological responsibility in art and design. And then he said it's becoming more and more serious in his mind, what we talked about. And he said that he started out after graduation as a very successful industrial designer and working for primarily in furniture. Bombay, Bombay store, sort of high-end furniture store. So he was very successful, and then he was making sort of commission piece. And then soon he realized that he cannot even afford to buy the stuff that he's making. And then in the meantime, he was also touring all over Asia, looking at the factories and so on. And then he was appalled by the way in which that cheap stuff is manufactured under dire conditions in order to satisfy our consumerism. So he got to the sort of fork in the road, and he decided to quit. And I hope people in industrial design doesn't take this as a lesson. But what he did was that he then went to nursing school, and he's finishing getting the registered nurse degree. And as he's working in the hospital, he realized that more than ever, he said the design is really important for the the nurses station. And the workstation, that really needs redesigning to accommodate and make the work more efficient and pleasant. So that's where he wants to go, that he will work as a nurse, but he will bring his design skills. And so that's still kind of within capitalist system, although you're not really producing capitalist goods, but that's another possibility, I think, where we need designers, we need artists.
Hello. Okay. So Damien opened the conference, and one of the questions he opened it with was, who are we designing for? And taking into consideration, especially Ijlal's commentary on the cultural disconnect in this socially responsible architecture, I was wondering if any of you could speak to how we can reconcile making culturally and ecologically sensitive design, and the fact that money and often space for discourse for these projects are in the hands of those holding an often static and arguably Eurocentric aesthetic values and ideals.
I would offer just some brief opening thoughts and let the panel take over. Listening to the talks, I would say it's a question of engendering a process and a mode of attentiveness rather than a solution, right? So we have problem solving. So stretch problem and solving, make the hyphen as long as you can. And what happens in the middle is see that not as a negative critique, but that's precisely generative, productive work to bringing to surface the complexity. And that's also always contingent. You bring up a new, you address one complexity, relations change, and something else will come up, right? So ethics, if you want to be ethical or aspire to that ideal, it's not a solution. It's a rigorous struggle, unending rigorous struggle. And one of the things you have to pay attention to is, even when you say it's a cultural aesthetic, you've sort of stopped it, right? Like there is a cultural aesthetic, designer needs to address it, and that sort of makes it static. Cultural aesthetics, what appears as a cultural aesthetic from a distance, is conflicted. It's class-based, is all those intimacies that Brhigu was talking about exist, right? And those things are also waxing and waning, right? So to understand precisely how do you deal with the dynamism, dual-sidedness, often contradictory, conflictory entities or relations, how do you intervene and work with that? That I think is the challenge. I mean, you can make it static and simplify it, but to pay attention to that dual-sidedness, like, you're going to solve the problem of wheat or a dietary problem on one way is going to produce environmental crisis on the other. So all of them are related. How can you produce a design that can address that what it's solving? On the one hand, it's solving something, but it's also producing something else.
So I'll add one thought maybe to that Ijlal's opening statement was also very interesting, that what do we think about complexity? And it's not that design has been too abstract or Eurocentric. It hasn't been abstract enough, maybe, in the context that at least I've seen it in my own fieldwork. There was, at one point, a huge drive in while I was there. As you drove in, as you first came into where I was doing fieldwork, you saw these very anomalous one-room grey buildings in the horizon. It was almost like a shot in a Tarkovsky film. And I asked somebody initially, what the hell is that? This anomalous thing. And they said it's this World Bank huge project where every Sahariya family is going to be given a pakka home, a cement home. And I thought, wow, that's the design they came up with. It's a one-room box, which was then repurposed imaginatively by some people. But I would agree with Ijlal that the problem is not it's Eurocentric or complex, but that it hasn't been complex enough, maybe. And certainly we are offering you some terms for approaching that complexity. Within my own lexicon, agonistics, contestation, agonistic intimacy would be one way of thinking, that don't approach a place thinking this is community. Every space is an agonistic space, so one can understand the coordinates of an agon, of an agonistics, that these are the social tensions one is approaching here. Rather than just this flat community space. So that would be one term in a lexicon, and there'd be other.
I mean, you'll find your own answer, but mine has been to situate yourself inside the problem. That's the first thing. And from that position, you can play and you can say honestly what you see. But it's without any authority. It's just inside the problem. a voice from within the problem.
I'm going to reverse the Eurocentric and let me talk a little bit about Japanese garden here in the United States. So it's a reverse way. There are lots of, quote, Japanese gardens in the United States, and I've been to several of them. And some were successful, but most are not successful because they try to really just imitate pine tree, lantern, the usual suspect. And I think that many times when I teach Japanese aesthetics, we get into the discussion about what really is Japanese garden? Does it have to have pine trees? Does it have to have lantern? Does it have to have, certain features that we usually associate with Japanese garden? And my sort of a take is that no. I mean, what needs to be taken is the principle behind design, whether you are dealing with cactus or rock or desert. And so I think that the sort of sensitivity to the particular space, the culture, and the topography, and what is available, and that definitely, I think, needs to be taken into consideration. And so that's why many Japanese gardens here, I think, do not work. Even if it may look like Japanese garden, which you find in Kyoto. And it's interesting that the gardener who did MFA Japanese garden, and unfortunately I don't think it's really well maintained, but when it was first constructed, the gardener, a really well-known gardener who was invited from Japan to design the garden, he spent the first 3-4 months going on the little airplane, go up and down the New England coast. And presumably the only thing that he brought from Japan is one lantern, and everything else is not from Japan. And so I think it's a roundabout way of talking about it, but I think that even if there's a sort of a Eurocentric design, that can be, I think, the certain principle, if it's appropriate, can be adapted, I think, to a particular cultural and climatic conditions. So
I think we have time for one more question.
Let me end on a negative note. Yeah. One characteristic of design, it has a curse. The moment you touch anything as a designer, you elevate its value. Right? So as soon as you elevate the value, you outprice someone who was already using it in whichever way, for which that object was their upper limit. Right? So design itself creates an antagonism. You touch it, it goes, and then someone has to subsidize input money to bring those who are now excluded back to the same plane where they can use it. Right? So we don't remember that the design itself creates these antagonism and divisions as it goes up. And as it goes up, if you leave it there, it might be the most beautiful solution, but will have its limits. Right? It is excluding, no matter how well designed. So and that could be your project. You can defend it politically. Either defend those boundaries, who it's for, or bring those who have been excluded back into the realm of representation and ask someone else to design for it. We'll end it.
So I think, should we take one more question? Or no? All right, so I think we're going to just go into the next, I'm getting cues here. Yes.
Yes.
5 minutes and then we're going to re-get situated.
Yes.
Why end on a downer? What the hell?
No, it's a responsible, not a downer. So you take responsibility of what you do.
Yeah, and I don't know what that is necessarily different. We should continue to go by that.
This is good stuff.
I do this.
I'm sorry, I cannot.
I can.
I really loved your talk.
No, thanks.
The wabi-sabi kind of the aesthetic of kind of just, letting things be something new.
Yeah, well, yeah. I don't want to exoticize it, but, it's just